Hello, everyone. I see the participants are starting to tick up, so I'm just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Leslie Hendrickson. I'm with the Newburyport Literary Festival, and we're excited to welcome you to our second day of programming in the Newburyport Literary Festival's first online incarnation. Just a few things before we get started. We're using the webinar format, which means you will not see yourself. You will only see the panelists, unlike a meeting where you see everyone. The session is going to last about 30 minutes, and there will be time for questions at the end. Please use the Q&A tab below. You can also check out the chat to find a link to our website, which has more information about the author and the rest of the events for today. There are also links to our independent bookstore partners, the Bookshop of Beverly Farms and Jabberwocky. They have books from all of the authors in our festival, and we encourage you to support them or your local independent bookshop. And now I'm going to turn it over to Richard Welch, who is a novelist, and his book is called What Carries You. Thank you so much for being here, Richard.
My pleasure. Hey, good to see everyone. I am here to talk about my book, my novel that I recently wrote called What Carries You. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a few selections, and so you get a sense of what the book is like. Of course, the best way to do it is for you to go buy the book and to read it. But I think this will give you a taste of the book. The book is a novel which is written in the form of a memoir, a fictional memoir by the narrator. And he begins when he's 8 years of age. An 8-year-old child remembers everything. The smell of cigarette smoke and cheap cream sherry as your parents sat talking on the porch every night before dinner. The taste of watermelon as the shiny brown seeds swirled against your tongue. The bumper sticker attached with wire onto the family Bel Air station wagon that read Kennedy Johnson. And the sound of your mother scattering pots in a metal drawer when she was searching for the frying pan. You remember Sunday mornings when your father, wearing your mother's stained apron, made breakfast, doled out donuts and favorite sections of the Sunday paper to each child, delivered the meal on a tray to your mother, propped up and smiling in bed, and changed the bed sheets in each room while humming along with Judy Garland, spinning on the portable player. Summer days lounge, the cicadas buzz high in the locust trees. The water over the dam barely trickles. The oaks cast a deep shade, and the humidity gives everything a slight mustiness. You remember it all, including the sound of handcuffs being snapped on your father's wrists. As one will see if they read the book, the narrator has a lifelong friend, Mark, and they are sometimes joined in the summers by a younger boy named Alex. So Mark and I were left to ramble with Alex and occasionally assert our dominance, particularly if our parents were not around. And being the early to mid 1960s, our parents were rarely around. They were busy raising younger children or making a living. Call it benign neglect of independent and adventurous boys in the country. But it all seemed to work, at least when firearms, secretly borrowed from the gun rack of Mark's dad, were not at hand. Lobster juice and butter ran off our chins and onto our bare chests as we cracked the shells and devoured the meat. We decided that Alex, having found the trap in the tide pool rocks and being the faster eater, should have the fourth lobster. Alex then announced, "Let's strip down and take a swim." Mark and I quickly hit the water, and Alex was close behind. The water was stunningly cold. As Mark and I plodded toward shore, Alex ran up between us and placed his arms over both our shoulders. We responded by draping our arms over his shoulders. He gripped us harder. With our shins still covered by water, Alex turned the three of us toward the quickly rising sun. Although he was out of breath, he managed to say, "Isn't this beautiful? Isn't this just great?" The narrator becomes a federal prosecutor. Obviously, this is fictional, but I did sort of borrow the framework of my professional career. And when he's a professional, when he's a prosecutor, a certain matter happens. Kent Powers, a veteran of the FBI, repeated, "The contract is for $25,000. He's already paid half and will pay the other half when you're dead." Kent, like so many agents, had a flat Midwestern voice that sounded like a watered-down version of Tom Brokaw. "I guess you're just lucky. The state police have an informant who tipped us off. Then we confirmed it by chatter on the wiretap. We have to move on this. Can you pack a bag and meet us at your office in an hour?" "Pack a bag? Where am I going?" "Well, you can't stay at your home. They already gave your address to the shooter." Gave my address to the shooter? That is the type of statement that focuses one's attention real quick. So it was that I was flown in complete secrecy and on a government plane to Gardner, Montana. I met Special Agent Gail Wilson. She had a serious attitude with a slightly upturned nose, dark hair, attractively styled in a boyish cut, a solidly trimmed body, full lips, clear skin, the color of milk chocolate, and a sawed-off shotgun. My kind of pretty when there's a price on your head. The narrator loses his father. I do not grieve by crying or reminiscing. I simply take a plane back from Boston to Idaho. I flee. I escape. I try to keep my mind blank, but I cannot forget that slight squeeze of goodbye. And so the narrator goes into the wilderness of Idaho to fly fish along a wilderness stream to get away from it all, but unfortunately finds that there are plenty of other fishermen on this stream and a family with llamas camped who come to camp right next to him. The afternoon was hot. I stretched out and slept under a magnificent cedar that shaded my camp. I awoke as late afternoon thunder rolled through the valley. The llamas had hopped nearer to my tent. At this closer range, they looked rather sweet and dumb. They reminded me of a kind-hearted, mentally challenged girl I knew in the 4th grade. I stood and slowly approached both the llamas and my tent. Although I was still a full 5 feet away from the seemingly sweet, dim-witted animals, the closest llama twisted its neck quickly curled back its lips in a grotesque smile, and vomited foul-smelling greenish-yellow snot on my left shoulder and arm. As I sat in a small pool, scrubbing my arm and neck with river sand while wringing out my shirt, I looked up at the dark cumulus clouds that had filled the sky and listened to the busy water in the creek. Facing the wilderness and the stream shielding any sound, I began to cry. Of course, there was no rational basis for this drama. Here I was, a man well into my 30s, a successful, hard-nosed federal prosecutor with enough money to jet out to the wilds of Idaho and fly fish. A man with excellent health, whose father had lived a full life. Of course, I wept all the more. Finally, I lay face first in the stream and dunked my head towards the stony bottom, then stood up, pushed the hair out of my face, and headed to shore. The narrator, after various romantic mistakes, actually marries a woman that he truly loves. I spurned my friend's suggestions to honeymoon at fancy Western dude ranches. Instead, I decided to take my new bride on the most fascinating portion of the Lewis and Clark Trail. Back at Loxa Lodge, at the bar and the pool table, my luck was not changing. As a result, plenty of people wanted to play me for beers, and a colorful group it was. Some had teeth. Many displayed long knives strapped to their ample legs. A few had washed their hair at least a few times that summer, and camo was the fashion of choice. Despite certain cultural differences, we all had a jolly time with a satellite dish beaming the Miss Universe pageant. Many of us liked Miss Ireland. I doubted that if the enlisted men of the Corps of Discovery had this type of entertainment when they secretly made up some homemade brew just downstream from here. My surveying of the talents of Miss Denmark ceased when another incredibly large man grasped my shoulder, pointed to Jess seated in a corner, and said, "That your gal? You best pay some attention to that outfit." There is something that turns one to chalk when you see the woman you love bravely sitting in a smoky bar with an untouched beer, watching Miss Universe deep in the Idaho wilderness. As tears welled up in her eyes, her only words were, "I just want to go home and spend my life with you." On this trip, we had not found some Northwest Passage of our own, probably because one does not exist. So, as did the Corps, we headed back east. Unlike Private John Coulter, we would not stay and live in the Rocky Mountains. Our voyage of discovery, however, was just beginning. We proceed onward. My older son is only 11, but is a much different child than his father at that age. He has strengths of courage, patience, determination, and caring that never crossed my young mind or creased my adolescent soul. With both hands clutching his cap, we cast off and are away, sweeping along the massive current of a river as big as the Merrimack. Makes me feel as free as Huck Finn. A light breeze scarcely ripples the surface. Their early gray light silhouettes the massive pines and oaks along the bank, and the pink horizon augurs a fair day. With this first light, the world is full of promise. We skim along the surface. Our destination is a series of islands in the middle of the river, where the Atlantic salt mixes thoroughly with the salt melt of New Hampshire. I know that downstream Joppa Flat will be full of boats and anglers, but here we are surprisingly alone. We drift past the islands with their granite outcroppings. The tide has just turned, and the small marsh creeks are spilling out into the river channels. Not a bug bothers us, but the river surface is empty. I tell my son to wait. I make the foolish promise that in just a minute he will see fish. Of course, I am setting him up for disappointment. It may be just another boring venture of few fish, many a tangle, and increasingly stressful parental commands. I am looking at my beautiful boy when I see that, for once, the magic is with me. His entire face lights up and his eyes dance, and for good reason. I turn and see the calm surface has erupted with a series of swirls. The bass are so close to the surface that fins and tails are in the air. The river is alive for as far as one can see. And then the words any father loves to hear. You're right, Dad. It is a marvel. Most of these fish have traveled from the Chesapeake, hundreds of coastal miles, past the seals, up the river, and now feast upon these New England herring. I have seen this abundance before, but with my excited son at my side, I now see it with fresh eyes. As we drift with the fish, I can actually hear the swirls. The slapping tails and jumping herring are within arm's reach. I can feel the small tin boat shake as my son hums and involuntarily hops from one foot to another in joy. As the light comes up, everything seems so pure, so young and innocent. I look at the natural beauty reflected in my son's lovely face, and instead of reaching for my 8-weight rod, I stop and, to my surprise, whisper. I whisper that I hope this feeling will never end, that my son will always be so filled with joy, that he will always be excited by nature and the dawning of a new day. So, those are my little readings, and I don't know if there are any questions or comments or anything like that. And Leslie, I turn it over to you.
Well, that was great, Richard. Thank you so much. One of our first questions was about your process in terms of getting published. And so maybe you could tell us a little bit about what the inspiration for the book was, what your writing process was like, and then how you got it to a physical thing in the world.
Well, what I found was I would sometimes write a short story, and then I found that they sort of interconnected. And eventually I thought, well, I should interconnect them all and write a novel about the whole thing. Getting it published, though, is the hardest thing in the world. Writing is hard enough, but publishing is an inside ball game. It is really hard. You have to get an agent, and getting an agent is no easy matter. And being short of patience, as anyone will tell you I am, I instead decided, with some urging of writers of much more success than I, to self-publish and go with Amazon and self-publish with the aid of many people much more sophisticated with a computer than I am.
Gotcha. And a lot of folks are also asking about how you use your experience to write this novel and sort of the combination of the novel memoir format.
Yeah, well, what I did was I obviously used sort of my professional life and as sort of the backdrop. for completely fictional characters, with the exceptions of my sons. I have to admit that I sort of took them whole piece into certain things. But everybody else is a fictional amalgamation of people, and the events are completely fictional. And so, you write best about what you know about. And so I did that, but used imagination with everything. I mean, a lot of people who read this say, oh, I know who you're talking about, but I'm not talking about that person, and that sort of thing. But I do use sort of, I don't have the imagination to come up whole with a completely different life than the one I've lived.
Right. So what writing strategies do you employ to help your readers see the vivid imagery that you're using in your text?
Well, I intentionally want to write in a sort of a clear, simple style. As you know, I want people to enjoy the book. I mean, believe me, I can use bigger words, and I can use more sophisticated types of literary language than I do in the book. But as a good friend of mine who suffered a terrible accident, he's a quadriplegic, he had not read a book for a long time. And he read this book and he said, Richard, thank you for writing it in this style, because it really made it enjoyable to read again. And that, frankly, was all you can ask for as an author, having someone enjoy the book. I mean, after all, that's why we do it. That's why we read. It's for enjoyment. You know, we don't do it just to impress people. So I intentionally try to make it as accessible as possible.
And so how much is memoir and how much is fictional, and what is there a ratio?
I would say that with the exceptions of my two sons, and I do have one good friend who's passed, named Jack, in there, I would say that 90% is fictional, and the rest is from life.
Another question, who are your greatest literary influences? And secondarily, are you working on anything new?
The greatest literary influences, I would say that anyone who has read a fair amount has a lot of literary influences, but I intentionally tried to sort of channel both Norman Maclean in A River Runs Through It and Ernest Hemingway in his short story, The Big Two-Hearted River. I intentionally tried to channel them to show that, through sort of outdoor adventure, you'd sort of get to you get to a bigger deal and all. And so those were the two biggest literary influences in this work. I've read a lot. I'm always amazed at how effective a good author is. And after having read them, they become my literary influence for a week.
How did the narrator come to the Iowa, Idaho, Wyoming areas of the Rocky Mountains? How did that place get in there?
That's the 10% of real life, because I actually decided to. I grew up on the East Coast, but I always daydreamed of the Rocky Mountains, and so I decided on a whim once to go out to the area of Yellowstone National Park and look around and everything. And I fell in love with it. And a few years later, I decided to take a sabbatical from being a prosecutor. And I went and bought a small cabin out there and have loved it ever since.
Oh, very cool. A couple of questions about Marquand. Is he an influence on your writing? And also, you use a quote by Marquand in the front, and how does that relate to the storyline?
That's a good question. John Marquand, my grandfather, is a literary influence, but I don't really write in his style. He's a much better writer than I am, or was a much better writer in all. And his subject matter is much different. But I do think that he really captures the fact that when you're writing, you're really writing fiction, even though it resembles your own life. That the characters, no one person is a good character in a novel, because they're never interesting enough. You need an amalgamation of characters. Marquand recognized that. He would, everyone would always criticize that, oh, you're just writing about your life, or you're writing about so-and-so. But it wasn't true. It was, these were fictional characters. So, and I think I begin the book with a quote from him that goes along the same line, that this is fiction.
So again, in terms of the fiction and the fact, 2 or 3 people have asked, is the story of the FBI agent based in fact?
No, that's a good example. As a federal prosecutor, I certainly received death threats, and then as a judge, a contract was taken out on my life and that sort of thing. But I was never lucky enough to go out to the wilds of Montana with 2 FBI agents guarding me and that sort of thing. So, that's a good example of where you use a life experience and then you expand it to a fictional situation.
Gotcha. And what parts of the book would you say were the most challenging to write?
I think the parts of the book most challenging to write were probably the ones closest to you. When I wrote about the death of a father, and certainly my father died, and I found that difficult to write. But frankly, I think the process of writing is difficult, period, because to make it sound simple and smooth, it takes an awful lot of time. You can write down, you can say, oh, well, I could do that. But it's surprisingly difficult, because the revision process and thinking about it and everything and creating it is more difficult than it seems.
We're almost out of time. I really appreciate everyone being here. We have a few more questions, but I'm going to cut the line and take the last one and ask my traditional question, which is, what are you working on now in terms of writing?
Well, that's a good question. I am working on sort of a short story in my head right now, and trying to get it together. And who knows if it will ever actually appear on the page and all. But I think it might relate to the pandemic and all, because this is an extraordinary period of time that we're living through.
It is. It is. Well, I hope you're staying safe and sane in Newburyport.
Absolutely. It's an easy life up here.
Thank you so much for being here, and thank you to our audience for being here.
And thank you for everyone joining us today. Enjoy the book. Buy the book. You'll like it.
Thanks again, Richard. Take care.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye now.